In a recent instalment, we looked at the AN-FLR9 Circular Direction Finding Array, known as Wollenweber or the Elephant Cage. I showed you 8 sites around the world that are all now defunct and promised we'd come back to its predecessor, the AN-FRD-10, or classic Bullseye. One of the earliest scanning arrays that saw service in the Second World War was the German Wollenweber array. The basic Wollenweber is a set of vertical dipoles arranged in a circle with receiving ports connected to a sector of the array, and that sector commutated around the circle by means of capacitive coupling. The received signals were fed to the radio goniometer that combined the signals and produced a response proportional to the angular deflection. It sounds complex, and I suppose it is, but the device was used for azimuth direction finding and was said to be more accurate in bearings than American systems. After reverse engineering and studies at the University of Wisconsin, the United States Navy built a Wollenweber near Korea, Maine. Using sets of concentric receiving rings over 200 feet high and a diameter of 1300 feet, it operated from VLF frequencies up to VHF bands. Another was built for the Navy by the University of Illinois in the 1950s and 1960s. This system had 120 vertical monopole antennas and operated between 2 and 28 MHz, with 1/3 of the array connected to the receiver. Later, the Navy AN-FRD-10 became the most common developed system and consisted of 2 concentric rings of 120 elements in an 850-foot diameter circle covering the higher frequency range, and 40 elements in a 750-foot diameter covering the lower frequency range, 2 to 8 MHz, and this is the topic of today's video. The AN-FRD-10 Circularly Disposed Antenna Array, or CDAA, was used primarily by the United States Navy's Naval Security Group, and there were 16 built at a number of locations around the world during the Cold War for high-frequency radio direction finding, or HFDF, and signals intelligence, just like the FLR-9 we covered in the previous video. In 1959, the United States Navy awarded a contract to ITT Federal Systems to develop and construct a network of AN-FRD-10 systems. The first operational AN-FRD-10 was to be built at Naval Security Group Activity Base Hansa in Okinawa, Japan. FRD stands for Fixed Ground Radio Direction Finding. After construction was completed, modifications were made that changed the design of future FRD-10 arrays. The high-band reflector was reduced from 120 feet to 90 feet, and the outer high-band antenna ring was increased to 435 feet or 133 meters. For the remaining sites, the outer antenna elements were spaced every 3 degrees around the circle, and the outer reflector was 24.3 feet or 7.4 meters tall. The inner antenna elements were spaced every 9 degrees, and the inner reflector was 90 feet or 27 meters tall. The Naval Security Group operated and maintained the US Navy's FRD-10 systems. The system had several nicknames including Fred 10 and Elephant or Dinosaur cages, with the latter 2 names associated with the later FLR-9 arrays. The worldwide FRD-10 network was named Classic Bullseye in 1965. It complemented the ship-based Classic Outboard Tactical SIGINT DF system, as well as the Navy's Classic Wizard satellite-based ocean surveillance system. Classic Bullseye was the name assigned to the US government's program to install and operate the radio direction finding network. It was also referred to as Clarinet Bullseye and just Bullseye at various points of its development and rollout. The word classic was added later when permanently assigned first words were created for 2-word nicknames. Classic was the word used to designate programs related to the Naval Security Group, and Clarinet was used for programs related to the Chief of Naval Operations. 14 sites were originally constructed as part of the Classic Bullseye program, and 2 were installed for other purposes, which we'll come to. The 16 stations run by the NSGA were divided into 2 groups, Atlantic and Pacific. Looking at the Atlantic sector, we first come to an FRD-10 on the northwestern tip of Goleta Island in Panama. This was known as NSGA Goleta Island and was decommissioned in 1995. The array was abandoned in place and left to fall apart. On Google Earth you can see sections of the antenna strewn across the ground. An FRD-10 near Toa Baja, Puerto Rico has disappeared almost without trace in recent years after being damaged by a hurricane in 1998 and demolished in 1999. Known as NSGA Sabana Seca, only the central control building and a faint outline in Google Earth gives us any indication that such a huge structure sat on the site. Moving on to mainland United States now, and we come to an array at NSGA Homestead in Homestead, Florida. A clay pigeon shooting facility sits on the former antenna site now after Hurricane Andrew struck in 1992, causing significant damage, which ultimately led to the decommissioning and demolition of the site. Heading north, we reach NSGA Northwest, located in Chesapeake, Virginia. This array was decommissioned after the CDAA ceased operations on the 1st of June 2001, and dismantling started on June the 25th that year. The site is still a centre for security forces, but the antenna system is gone without trace except the circular outline. Further north is NSGA Winter Harbour, in Winter Harbour, Maine, the home of an FRD-10 that was decommissioned in 1998 and demolished in 2001. Like many other sites, the building has been repurposed, and the only clue that a huge elephant cage stood here is the outline in the earth. Moving to Canada now, and it's a very different story up here. The 770 Communications Research Squadron at CFB Gander, Newfoundland, still operates an FRD-10. In the centre of the array is a two-storey operations building about 40 metres square, where the station's intercept operators work. This was installed in 1970, and a look at recent Google imagery shows some sort of renovation or modification work being carried out on the array. Heading over the Atlantic to the UK, we come to NSGA Edzell at RAF Edzell, a former Royal Air Force satellite station located in Aberdeenshire, Scotland. This was the home of NSGA Edzell and an FRD-10 that operated until 1997, before the site was closed and the array demolished. Like the other sites we've seen, the obvious circle mark in the ground is the only clue that anything was there. And our final stop in the Atlantic sector, NSGA Rota at Naval Station Rota in Cadiz, Spain. This array was shut down in 1993 but not demolished until 2005, so we can see the antenna system on Google Earth. Modern imagery, however, reveals a circular scar in the landscape and not much else. Moving on to the Pacific sector now, and we come to NCTS Guam in Dodido on the island of Guam, and an FRD-10 that was decommissioned in 1999 and later demolished. We can see that the system lasted well into the 2000s, but a look at today reveals total redevelopment on the site, with the FRD-10 and its foundations gone without trace. The array at NSGA Hansa in Okinawa, Japan was decommissioned, and a decommissioning ceremony took place on September 10, 1997. The antenna wasn't demolished until May of 2007. The original operations building was a single-storey building. A two-storey addition was built in 1972 when Hansa assumed several missions from other NSG sites. Another 5,000 square feet was added in June 1979. It sat on what is now a residential development, and even the circular foundation is rapidly disappearing into the landscape. Alaska's FRD-10 was located at NSGA Adak, or Albert E. Mitchell Field, until its decommissioning in 1994. It was later demolished and only the classic circle remains. Next we come to an array at CFS Masset in British Columbia, Canada, which is still very much in use, and the second of the only two remaining FRD-10s still functioning. It's operated remotely from CFS Leitrim in Ontario, and like the other one over in Gander, Google Earth shows some sort of renovation or modification work taking place. The next site at NSGA Marietta in Marietta, Alderwood, Washington in the United States is unusual in that it was the first one to be closed after just 10 years of operation. Despite being closed in 1972, the circle outline can be seen on Google Earth over 50 years later. Heading over to California now and NSGA Skaggs Island in Sonoma County, we see a faint outline of another 1993 closure. This array was demolished in the mid-1990s and today only a scar remains in the landscape. Staying in California, we come to NSGA Imperial Beach. Installed in 1967, this CDAA was the last Navy Wullenweber to be installed in the vast worldwide HFDF network. It was decommissioned in 1999 and demolished in 2015, but the site is still used in the training of special forces. The circular foundation is slowly being reclaimed into this complex known as Silver Strand. And finally, the last of the NSGA-controlled FRD-10s at NSA Hawaii. This array was decommissioned in 1998 and later demolished in 2005. Today the site is still occupied by the NSA, but all trace of the FRD-10 antenna system has disappeared under a modern complex. While the AN FRD-10 was primarily used by Naval Security Group activities for DF and intercept, several were also used for general service communications. The communications facility located at Sugar Grove, West Virginia in the United States was home to two variants of the FRD-10 without goniometers built side by side for general service ship-to-shore communications. They were completed on November 6, 1968 and became operational on November 8, 1969. They provided increased capacity for simultaneous reception of ship-to-shore and overseas circuits. Neither of these two CDAAs were operated by the Naval Security Group. The northerly array was dismantled in 1997 and the other one was dismantled in 2005. AN FRD-10 systems were originally constructed in the early 1960s, but after the dissolution of the Soviet Union and the advent of more modern and automated technologies, the systems began to be shut down and demolished, as I'm sure this video has demonstrated. If you'd like to know more about the FRD-10's predecessor, the FLR-9, then I'll link that video below and at the end.